Sometimes in geography, to go forward and look at future topics, you have to almost go back and look at stuff you've already considered and see how it fits in. This is the first case of this I'm going to go through with you guys, because we're looking at a living world, but it definitely incorporates elements from natural hazards here for the first time. So as you can see on this picture here on the screen, this is how global climate shapes biomes around the world, okay? And as you can see, it's like a burger. You got the same thing on the top and the bottom, and then you got the thing in the middle. It's like a mirror image. If you put a mirror on the equator, in the middle of that red, in the middle, it's the same below as it is above. So at the very, very top and the very, very bottom, you got the polar climates, obviously where the polar cell is. Slightly further south or north, depending on where you're going from, it then turns temperate before you get drier. And then in the middle, where the intertropical convergence zone is, you have the tropical climates. That's because latitude influences temperature. Okay, and also to an extent, latitude influences climate more generally. For example, like rain. We'll get to that in a minute. But you know this is from natural hazards. Latitude influences temperature. The further away from the equator you are, the colder it gets. Okay, so that's going to work depending on it. It doesn't matter if it's north or south of the equator. The further north you go, the colder it gets. The further south you go, the colder it gets. And obviously, the nearer the equator you go from either direction, the warmer it gets. So I'm going to, leave that image there. If you want to pause the video, that is a really useful image. So you can see how it looks banded, how the climates are banded, like layers across the world. But there is more to this video too, because I want to put it down here. I didn't want to distract from this image that you can use. But ultimately, they are banded climates, north and south of the equator. It's called symmetrical, okay? Symmetrical because it's the same above as it is below. That's quite key. Also, think of the rainforest then. In living world, that is your first biome that we're going to be looking at, the rainforest. Is it low or high pressure? Well, let's go back to our work in terms of natural hazards. Low pressure is lousy weather, rainy, stormy, cloudy, whereas high pressure is happy weather, clear, dry, calm, no wind, or very, very little wind. So which of those do you think sounds more applicable to rainforest? Well, obviously, rain happens in the rainforest. It's very, very cloudy. That's why there's rain there. So it's low pressure. So you get low pressure at the equator in the tropical climates elements here in the red bit on this picture, and that is why the rainforest is the way it is. I'll come on to this at the very end, but basically the characteristics of your environment, the reason why the rainforest is the way it is because of its position on the earth. It's because of latitude. So let's take the tropical rainforest again. You all know where the tropical rainforest is on here because I've told you. It's on the equator. Okay, so it's in the red bit on this graph you can see here. So we know where the tropical rainforest is located. It's on the equator. That means, bear in mind, because of the banding, low, high, low, high, low, high pressure, that it's low, therefore it's lousy weather. But because of its latitude away from the equator, basically it's not very far from the equator, therefore it's hot. So the rainforest is hot and wet. Compare that to the desert. Think of the desert. Is that low or high pressure? Is that far from the equator? Well, in terms of far from the equator, it's also like the rainforest, not very far from the equator. But there's obviously a really big key difference between the rainforest and the desert. The desert being extremely dry. So it's a dry climate on this map. That's because it's high pressure, happy weather, dry, not very cloudy, no rain. That's going to give you desert conditions. But what also gives you desert conditions is how hot it is there. And that's because of its latitude, which isn't very far from the equator. It has a low latitude. What about the deciduous woodland? Well, that's where we live, so you got to get that one right. Is that low or high pressure? What about distance from the equator? Just from its position, you can work out the climate. If you've never been to the deciduous woodland before, but you knew where it was on this map, you'd know the climate of the area. So let's just say that the deciduous woodland in Argentina, some of you may have never been there before. Argentina, it's in the green band at the bottom there in the south of the globe. Therefore what? Right, so that means it's not very close to the equator, therefore it's not going to be hot. However, it's not in the polar, so it's not going to be ridiculously cold either. Therefore, you can expect mild temperatures. And what about high and low pressure? High and low pressure. Well, because of the Ferrell cell knowledge, we know that we're in a band of low pressure in our temperate climate. Therefore, it must be the same in Argentina. So, just from our knowledge of what it's like here, we can work out, because of the banding, because of the latitude and the symmetry, we can work out the climate in Argentina. We can work out the deciduous woodland is the same climate south of the equator as it is here in the UK, the north of the equator. So therefore, it's low pressure, therefore it's mild temperatures, and lo and behold, that's what we get. Now, the last thing I'm going to cover in this video very briefly, because I'll do this in a separate video of its own, using examples, is the plant and animal adaptations. So I'm going to give that its own video because this was the 9 marker in the last exam in 2024 in this summer series. But basically, the way the climate is shapes the characteristics of that biome. Okay, so let's take the tropical climates in the red in the middle, a tropical rainforest. Because of how near the equator it is, because of how therefore warm it is, and because it's a low pressure area, the plants and animals are adapted to that warm and wet environment. On the other hand, the desert, the Thar Desert you're looking at too, is in the dry climates. Therefore, plants and animals in that environment are adapted. They have to adapt. They've had to adapt over years to slightly different conditions. It's still hot, but it's very, very dry. So therefore, looking at those two examples, you're going to have plants in the rainforest that are adapted to surviving with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of rain all year round and warm conditions. Whereas in the desert, you're going to get different plants that have adapted to survive with very little rainfall and extremely warm temperatures too. So, think about this, the amount of trees in the Amazon compared to cactus in the desert, for example. But it's the same with animals, and we'll look at those in specifics next time, because that can be its own video, that can be its own entry. And it's important that you know that for the exam, because let's be fair, the 9 marker was on that last time. I mean, that does mean it's unlikely to be the 9 marker next time, but because they made a 9 marker out of it in 2024, they could easily pull a 4 or 6 marker out with some examples, maybe even with a diagram in 2025 and beyond. So it's important to note the adaptations, and we'll look at that next time. But ultimately, the key takeaways here is that the global climate and the way the biomes are in living world is because of our stuff from natural hazards. So it's symmetrical, north and south of the equator is the same. So it's banded in that sense, but also low and high pressure banding influences what the biomes are like. See you next time.